I mean, it's not an obvious answer, but if you think about it, maybe we can come up with some interesting observations. So what do the students think are the similarities between all four gardens?
Maybe the scale. They're all pretty large, like
Okay,
really huge.
interesting. Fair enough. All right, let's continue that thought.
What about the scale? I mean, one is scale of the plot, or scale of the project as such. But what other than that, what else about scale?
Not really sure, but like the natural entity is like obviously these are gardens, so the natural entities are overpowering in some sense.
All right. Any thoughts about? Okay, think of it as an urban design thing. How many layers can you all come up with? So I mean, you can think of it in terms of scale, ownership, um,
Maybe the
design.
program.
Yeah, program. Sure.
Yeah, like who in today's present time, no one can imagine creating a garden, especially for hunting on or some stuff relating to royal thing like hunting. There would be a lot of criticism in today's age. And, yeah.
Right. So I mean, I think what you're alluding to is that it's a private property belonging to an extremely uber rich person who manages to create a large garden. I mean, is that it? Is
Yeah,
that
like yes, if like even if today if someone owns a large property and he wants to create something uh, for himself or for a community, a smaller community belonging to him, but like in today's time we think about a larger society, like how uh, the project could affect the overall environment and not just creating something for oneself. Like the hunting rod wasn't for the whole city, right? It was for some royal people out in that age.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay, ठीक है. So I think we can set aside the political background for all four projects. What else unites them? I mean, in terms of design or design concept.
In all of them, there was a definite part to go around, like parts were created, and also a common thing which I found was there was a water body in like all of them. Also, there were sculptures kept, like the boar sculpture or the various on various themes. Also, scales like some sculptures were like maybe human sculpture were like human scale. So that's one thing.
Yeah. So, I think that's even the point that I think Lalit mentioned earlier. There are cultural connotations, right, which have changed meanings over time. So, like hunting was considered to be pretty okay at some point of time in the past, while now hunting is not seen as an activity which is like which could be regarded as being given enough importance for designing a huge garden about the sculptures, can anybody tell a little bit more about those sculptures? Like, for example, in Villa Lante, one would find sculptures which are surreal, which obviously are like a depiction of humans, but that's kind of surreal. While in Katsura, you'd find sculptures which are more of they're more of a metaphor, right? They're not sculptures which have been carved out to make it look like something that exists in reality, but rather it's an amorphous sculpture which is then kind of reinterpreted while in Claremont, you would find sculptures which are reminiscent of the natural, I mean, the animals around, but then again, a more, biomorphic form that has been kind of, recreated. So, I mean, I don't know if you guys noticed this, there is a difference in the way that sculptures are also used within the gardens. So, yeah, what is it, Anushri? You were going to say?
I was just thinking of how they are also dealing with nature as such as an entity, wherein like they want it to be tamed, maybe like next like our case study is about the restorative landscapes which we were looking at, and the way they deal with it is entirely different. So here it's more about, you know, the aesthetics and how humans interpret nature and would like to kind of, so although like the scale is overpowering in a way, but also I feel that it's more like the humans want to leave a mark on what they are creating and how they are dealing with nature as such. So like uh, I found that quite interesting and different. Approach was different from what we are looking at in restorative landscapes like after that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such a nice point to make. I mean, I discerned 2 points in them. One was that there is an approach towards aesthetic, and I mean, the idea of not having a program, not the landscape, not being utilitarian, it being more leisure and aesthetics being a much more important part of designing uh, is such an interesting observation to make for a historical landscape. And those are not the kind of luxuries we can afford to have nowadays. At least that's what I think when I see students' views or students' designs on spaces. I think the other point was definitely that Anushree made was that how there's a lot of taming of the landscape, even with the idea. I mean, even though you're trying to create a natural setting, there's a lot of maintenance that goes into these landscapes. And one of the things that definitely came out when Claremont was being presented privately in last time's classes was how Claremont Gardens had gone bad and it had overgrown because it was not maintained. And the English at least had this idea of the gardens, the landscape dressed. At least that's what they called it. And what was essentially was that they would take this overgrown place and then they would start not exactly manicuring it, but then they would start dressing it and making it look naturalistic and natural at the same time. But I mean, they would go through a lot of lengths to make sure that the hand of, uh, I mean, at least in the Japanese and later English gardens, they would try to make sure that it doesn't look like it's artificial, but it is. When you think about it, when you think about the maintenance required, it requires a lot of maintenance, and it is so artificial. And that's another interesting takeaway. I mean, thanks, Anushree.
Actually, on that note, I was about to just mention this, that we saw 4 different style of gardens. There was these Baroque style. We started with Villa Lante, and then move on to more gardens which were more informal in structure. So I was going to mention the same thing, that do students gather from these presentations that as they were all in the timeline inspired from each other, but they started digressing from that formal setting. What do you all think made that happen? Why would that change happening? But I think Arjun mentioned one of that maybe maintenance was one part of it which pushed the garden design history. I mean, in the progression of the garden design history, the design started moving towards, obviously there was a cultural impact on how the design started changing its form and shape, but also maybe time led to these designs being more informal, which required less maintenance. Is there anything else anyone feels that led these garden designs to change from more formal, baroque, like the most symmetrical form, to more natural form?
Yeah, especially the unsuccessful politician's garden. Like as I mentioned before, that it was born out of this bromance between the artist and the politician. I think, and how they were trying to depict his life story in this landscape sort of manner, and every detail, every element in that garden was, meticulously designed. Like every single pavilion, like even when Amit mentioned the sit and listen pavilion, they've purposely planted those banana trees around the pavilion so that when the rain falls on the leaves, it makes a very distinct sound. So and in some sense, like they wanted to make it organic, yet it was it's like a man-made thing, and like we can't really tell because even the pathways, something as small as a pathway, they kept it not a straight path, but like a zigzag sort of pathway. And in like the belief was that zigzag pathways ward off evil spirits and something like that. So I think that really matters, like those particular elements that they've put as design.
Okay.
No, that's very true. That's quite true. I mean, you'll be very surprised to find out how many of these gardens are based on not just cultural references, but even artistic references. And so many of these gardens in England are sort of are spatial recreations of Greek of Greek epics. One of them is like that, and then I mean, this Chinese garden was sort of a response to how an artist reinterpreted space uh, based on poetry and art of the times. And this is a very common theme that tended to happen in these uh, large historic gardens. That's very true. In fact, it actually leads you to think that if landscape if landscape finds, I mean, I know this is not landscapes of meaning, but still, if landscape tends to find meaning because it is a response to art and cultural references, if you had to derive a landscape for an Indian language or any local Indian region, what would you respond to, or what cultural references or artistic references would you respond to if you were doing this for India? And that's a funky question I used to ask students from time to time. We once even had an exercise to that effect, but I mean, I just thought I'd share that with you.
Well, that's a nice question, Arjun. I mean, it's very thought provoking. What do you guys think, students?
Could you ask the question again? I couldn't quite catch it.
Yeah, sure. So, all right, I'll give you the background. So, if we were talking about French gardens, the French gardens were sort of followed from this idea that the nobility was the center of the universe. So the king was the sun king. So there are these interesting paintings of the Garden of Versailles where the entire landscape, all the mountains and rivers are perfectly symmetrical across the garden, right? And that means to say that all of nature is centered on the garden, which is centered on the palace, which is centered on the king. When it came to English 18th century landscape gardens, there were these very interesting Netherlands paintings about the landscape where it is not centered on people, or it's not anthropocentric. It's more like you're seeing this very wild nature, lots and lots of sky, lots and lots of earth, and it's an appreciation of what nature is around you. And then you start noticing that those kind of paintings become the reference points for English landscape gardens of the 18th century. So again, you're seeing something very similar. You're seeing that the gardens follow from art movements that surrounded the time of when these gardens were built. So the question was, if we were to design an Indian garden, right, an Indian landscape garden, what art would you refer to, and what cultural references would you refer to create a garden of the Indian language? And I'm saying Indian language very broadly. Obviously, we are a lot more. It's a lot deeper than, and it's a lot divided than just calling it Indian. But I'm just using that word very generally. What references would you look at? So an interesting reference that always comes up, and I always remember, is Shah Rukh Khan with his arms open, Kajol running towards him. The backdrop is sarson ke khet, and all the flowers are blooming. So it's obviously somewhere close to winter time. But saying that is an interesting Indian landscape to refer to when creating an Indian landscape garden is an interesting way of looking at things. Are you following what I just said?
Yeah.
All right. So then the question was, what would you refer to when you're thinking about an Indian landscape garden?
We can also look at Mughal gardens, which gave importance to like a particular power or something.
Yeah, but that's almost an architectural or a landscape reference. I'm asking for a cultural and an artistic reference.
Okay.
Probably like the religious art forms that existed in the temple caves.
Okay, what else? I mean, feel free to go completely crazy on these kind of references. I mean, another interesting reference is, that Amitabh Bachchan ad for Gujarat where he's standing on the salt. Where is he standing? I keep forgetting.
The salt pans, yeah.
Yeah, the salt
Yeah,
pans,
the
yeah.
run of Kutch, run of Kutch.
Run of Kutch, yeah, the run of Kutch. I mean, it's important to sort of start visualizing what the intellectual environment is around the designs we make. I mean, that's what it's sort of about. And someone mentioned, I think Yash mentioned Varli, yeah, which is it's a nice example.
I think it would be very diverse from Rajasthan to Northeast to the Himalayas and the Gangetic.
Yeah, definitely. Like we had this exercise
Absolutely.
in academy. We in a class of 30, we had approximately 20 examples all across, and it was difficult to sort of categorize them together, but it was very interesting to just study those examples as a backdrop for Indian landscapes. But I mean, there's a question that a lot of people have tried to think about. You can go all the way to, the landscapes described in Meghdut, the landscape showed in Indian movies. Ravan is in the Ravan the movie. Is it Ravan? Yeah, Ravan the movie, which is an interesting. I mean, it's a fantastic backdrop of Karnataka landscape, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, it's Karnataka and Kerala.
Yeah, Karnataka and Kerala, and I mean, the explosion of the media allows us to have a lot more references, and that makes our job much more difficult. But it's interesting to think about Indian landscape in those terms as a response to cultural references, not just as a response to existing gardens and existing buildings.
Oh, very nice. I mean, I think that there's a lot of references that way. Like if one has to think. What do you guys think, students?
I have a question actually. Like, if we look at the Chinese or gardens or like the Japanese gardens or even the European gardens, we can distinctly tell that they have a style, they have particularities. But why is it so difficult for us to imagine like an Indian landscape garden? Like we're taking so much time to come up with these, even though India has such rich cultural aspects to it. Why is it that difficult for us to come up with an Indian style garden or something?
I don't know. I guess I'm sure the answer is a lot more complicated, but it's. I'm not sure if it's absolutely right to say that we don't have an Indian garden. I mean, we have a Mughal garden. I mean, I'm sure it's also true of England uh, that it's an English garden but not a Scottish garden, and it's an English garden, not a Welsh or an Irish garden. It does not reflect uh, what every part of British geography thinks of as an English garden. I mean, I'm sure that's also true, and that's also probably true of China. And therefore, when we say a Mughal garden, we don't necessarily mean Indian garden. Uh, that's one part of my answer. The other is that I mean the Vedic times have had a very clear idea of what are the different kinds of landscapes, and we sort of used to describe from Upvan all the way to Mahavan, and those were basically descriptions of what landscapes are. So that existed. We just don't have the actual. I mean, I'm not sure if we have an Upvan of Vedic times still uh, existing here today. But my guess is that if we ever saw an Indian garden, we are more likely to call it by its more local name. Like we would more likely to call it a Mughal garden or a Maratha garden, not necessarily an Indian garden. But I don't think that answers your question. I'm just like rambling right now.
No, and it's also because the imagination of a garden in an Indian city or an Indian settlement has been very different, and so like for example, if I were to tell you this that even um, like in the northern states, the provinces at that time, the northern kingdoms, what used to happen was settlements were very tight. and open spaces like where people would fly kites, and like the idea of recreation or leisure was not strolling in a garden, unlike in the West or in Japan or anywhere else. I mean, those ideas were very different, like what Arjun rightly said, Upuvan, Mahavan and Shrivan. So Shrivanas were basically, they were sacred groves. So they were not designed per se in a certain axis or a geometry or a philosophy. I mean, it would either be along with the temple or along with the palace. If it's with the palace, then it's usually a private property or restricted access. If it's with the temple, then again there are restrictions based on caste and other things. So the idea of public, the idea of leisure were very different in different parts of India, the present India, than what it was in the West. And quite interestingly, all these gardens that we saw today, even though they are all open to public now, in reality, all of them are private, properties. So, I'm not sure about the garden of the unsuccessful politician, but the other ones are all private properties. Like they've recently become public in nature. So, yeah.
I think that Indians, except for the Mughal gardens, there was no such concept as to expressing your culture or your identity through a landscape or a garden. I mean, we have sacred groves or gardens, but they are like restrictive. Like they are our very pure. They are holy, and they don't have that quality of of exhibiting or celebrating their culture as the Romans or Greeks did. So they were more kind of conservative and not so expressive. So yeah.
And there were always
Um,
this utilitarian concerns also. Sorry, I think I cut somebody short. Go ahead, go ahead.
No, Sandeep, continue. Then I'll.
Yeah, Shruti. Yeah, go ahead, please. No, I was just saying that that there were always these utilitarian, like for example, if you go down south, so the Vijayanagaras and the Cholas, they all essentially created gardens, but then those gardens were more of orchards, or there were temple tanks, and and then there would be flower gardens, but then the flower was essentially cultivated so that they could be used for the temple purposes. So, the idea was like what Ishan said, like Mughal gardens were meant to be experienced, like these other gardens that we saw today. But the idea of gardens in India, where the experiential aspect was only secondary. I mean, there were other aspects which kind of determined why they were. Yeah, go ahead, Nashri.
Okay. It was also because of the division of the caste and sex that different sets of people used to uh, visualize their open spaces differently. Plus, utilitarian, like if you go back in the history, experience of water we have done through not through gardens but through landscape interventions. So those things will also should be accounted for. So that culture and water were used to be experienced by making hearts in different formats and understanding the flow of the river, etc. So I would not say the culture was not experienced using landscape expressions in India, but it was very different. There was no distinct style to be documented or to refer back to, but there are bits and pieces. In bits and pieces, there are instances, there are places where we could refer back to. Of course, not as bold as Chinese or Italian.
Yeah. Like they weren't necessarily gardens, like ghats, the expression of celebrating, like touching water, or just being there. The step
Yeah.
wells of Modera, so but they were not really gardens per se.
Gardens. True.
I think that's also because India has always been throughout history under very heavy influence of in that set era who were we ruled by, like from Dravidians to coming to Mughals, then Rajputs having their time. But Rajputs also, when they did their gardens, I believe they were heavily influenced by Mughals as well as Europeans. And then we had the British colonization, so British got their thing in. So I think because of this entire journey of being ruled, I feel that's my personal thing that we never defined our how what would essentially call like an Indian garden design. We have always built upon from what we extracted by the people who ruled us.
Maybe the last, I think the last pleasure garden I can think of is the gardens in Kashmir. I mean, are there any other specifically pleasure gardens in India? I'm just asking the professors. I have no idea.
There is also the Sahelion ki Baudi in Udaipur. But I think it was designed,
okay.
I'm not very sure, I think it was designed by British or someone, like a British architect or someone.
Yeah, possible.
It's like there are
Yeah,
these series. It's I think that entire landscape of Udaipur was kind of designed considering the so it's like lakes at various levels, and then the water kind of keeps on overflowing from one lake to another, and at the bottom or at the base or something you have the Sahelion ki Baudi, which was meant for like the queens.
Yeah, I mean
A
the
pleasure
Sahelion
beach.
ki Baudi does have a very not colonial, but I mean it
It's
has one of
Baudi,
those.
it's Bari. No, it's Sahelion ki Bari.
I keep hearing it wrong. Even when I'd gone there, I would keep saying Baudi. But yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. I mean, there are these lawns and they're divided by pathways, and then the borders are being planted. And there's this very nice. And the only interesting place I thought was that water body, which
Yeah.
has these alcoves all around. And that's the
And
only.
like the
That's the
sound
only.
of rain.
Right. That's the only space I couldn't place. But if all the other landscape
Because of the
areas look
sound.
very English. Yeah. All right. Interesting.
Yeah, and then I think somewhere in the early 1900s, 1920s or 1930s, there was also this Vrindavan gardens which were designed in Mysore. In the pre-independent India. I think that was also one of those pleasure gardens. But I'm not sure if it is, but yeah.
Oh, but designed by an Indian?
I think so. Yes, yeah. I think so. I think it was the Vodayers or the. I'm not sure who designed it per se, but yeah. It was either the Divan or it was some clergymen who kind of designed it.
But then these are not. I mean, these are not colonial or Indo-Sassanic or colonial influenced gardens.
But that's I think the Vrindavan gardens in Mysore are like an amalgamation of the Mughal gardens and a little bit of Italian gardens. It's like you'd find.
Yeah. You get that a lot here. I mean, yeah.
Okay. Even this idea of even the Mughal gardens, the way that we see today, like Taj Mahal. If I were to ask you to imagine Taj Mahal, you close your eyes, you would think of the lawns and the parterres and all of it. But the truth is, lawns were a British import. So the original Taj Mahal garden or any of these Mughal gardens never had lawns. Except for the ones in Kashmir, which were the wild meadows, which would kind of take over during the spring and then it would kind of die off. But then lawns was a British import into India, and it kind of stuck around so much that for us, for most of us, like not probably the professors we know, but for most of us, when you imagine a landscape, it has to be completely green and with the lawns, Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah. Any other observations or any other comments, or do we move to the next set of presentations? Rahul, Ishan.
I think let's move and then have one round of discussion after that set of presentation as well.
Sure.
Okay, so we are tightening the time available to us. We have about 1 hour, 1.5 hours. That means in 1 hour we need to complete. 25 minutes we definitely need to complete the presentations.
Yeah. Should I share my screen?
Yeah, please go ahead, Aisha.
Yeah, this time can the CR time it, and right after 6 minutes, 20 seconds, can you just ask the person to stop the presentation? We won't want to interrupt, but can one of the CRs do it?
I thought
we will
Atira
do
was
it.
doing it.
Yeah, she was putting it on the chat, but later on, we thought that that is why we stopped.
No. I see. If I were you, I would just put the timer on. When it's 6 minutes 40 seconds, I would just unmute and kind of make it sure that they hear it. Yeah, go ahead.
Should we start?
Yes. So this is the series on landscapes of meaning, right?
Meaning. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure.
Hello everyone. Our structure is FDR Memorial, which is situated in Washington, D.C., United States, and it falls under the category of landscape of meaning. Lawrence Halprin is an American landscape architect, designer, and teacher. He won the competition for memorial design in 1974, but the government did not appropriate the fund to move beyond the conceptual stage for more than 20 years. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the 32nd President of the United States. In 1921, he contracted paralytic illness and his leg became permanently paralyzed, and he won the presidential election in 1932. FDR Memorial is dedicated to the memory of Franklin Roosevelt, situated in Washington, D.C., and is spread over 7.5 acres adjacent to the southwest side of Tidal Basin along West Potomac Park. The project cost around $48 million and funded largely by the federal government. Its construction started in 1991 and opened to the people in 1997.
In 1941, Roosevelt said that if he were to have a monument in Washington, it should be in front of the National Archives and should be no longer than his desk. A wide block of white marble was subsequently dedicated in 1965 as his memorial near the southeast corner of 9th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue within a lawn in front of a National Archives building. The FDR Memorial design consists of 4 outdoor rooms and gardens animated by water, stone, and sculpture. A meandering pathways lead past waterfalls, bronze sculptures, and FDR's own powerful words carved on granite wall. With its shade trees, waterfalls, and quiet alcoves, feels more like a secluded garden than a traditional memorial walls. Of a red South Dakota, of a red South Dakota granite define the memorial's outdoor rooms and the passageways connecting them. Each room conveys, in its own way, the spirit of a man. Each room representing Roosevelt's respective term in office contains a waterfall. As one moves from room to room, the waterfall becomes larger and more complex, reflecting the increasing complexity of a presidency marked by vast upheavals of economic depression and world war. The sculptures are inspired by photographs of President Franklin. The other sculptures depict scenes from the Great Depression.
In room 1, a bronze bas relief of first inauguration, one of the early public sculptures created by Robert Graham, introduces the first years of Roosevelt's presidency as a response to the worst economic crisis the nation had ever known. George Segal created the powerful sculpture in room 2, the breadline, which represents the despair of Great Depression. And the fireside chat depicts the hope that Roosevelt's inspiring words gave to ordinary people. In room 3, of the memorial, a waterfall crashes over scattered boulders, suggesting the destruction and violence of World War II, which dominated Roosevelt's third term in office. Neil Easton created the statue of Roosevelt and his dog Fala, calmly presiding over the chaos surrounding them. Franklin's hopes for the future are engraved on the wall next to his statue.
The centerpiece of room 4 is monumental bas relief created by sculptor Leonard Baskin. The funeral cortege represents the nation in mourning after the death of the only president many of them could remember. Neil Armstrong's statue of Eleanor Roosevelt honors her contributions as First Lady and as one of the early delegates representing the United States at the newly formed United Nations. There are many water features in the project with their own meanings. There's the water feature comprised of one large drop, which depicts the crash of economy that led to Great Depression. A multiple stair-like drop, which pays a homage to Tennessee Valley Authority dam building project. A chaotic falls at varying angles signifies World War II, and a still pool for Roosevelt's death. Harplin carefully designed the FDR Memorial FDR Memorial to be accessible for the people with all kinds of disabilities. Among other features, the memorial includes an area with tactile reliefs and braille writing for the people who are blind.
However, the memorial faced serious criticism from the disabled activists because the braille dots were improperly placed and monumented 8 feet off the ground, placing it above the reach of most of the people. Tourists walk through the memorial between cherry blossom and sakura trees in spring, which is also said to celebrate the values and accomplishments of past generations in crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, we are done.
Good, good. Who's next?
Next, us, Avanti, can you share screen?
Yep.
Yeah. So Sundar Nursery was established at the northern edge of the Latin Delhi. It is actually flanked between different World Heritage sites, like the Humayun's tomb on the south, the Purana Killa on the north, and the Grand Trunk Road on the west. Avanti, next. Yeah, so it was basic. It was designed by Shahir Architect Associates, and it is spread over 90 acres. It contains different heritage monuments and also different gardens and trees along, making it the Delhi's first arboretum. Next.
Bagh-e-Azim now Bagh-e-Azim, now Sundar Nursery, is a 16th century work. In the 20th century, the nursery was used by the British to grow experimental plants from different parts of the world during the planning and construction of the Imperial Delhi concept, the complex. It was conceived in 2007 and was completed on 21st February 2008. It draws its influences from the Persian garden, the Char Bagh or the Chahar Bagh. The garden also replicates 4 micro-habitat zones that are a part of Delhi's original landscape: Kohi, the ridge; Bangar, the alluvial; Khadar, the riverine; and Dabar, the marsh.
The 30 acres of biodiversity zone spread in the nursery, which includes the ridge, riverline, marshy, and alluvial soil, provides diversity for flora and fauna. The Sundar Nursery is Delhi's first arboretum, with having almost 300 species of trees, being the lone species in India. Living connection of the trees provide a continuous stretch of dense green cover across the Sundar Nursery. Over 80 species of birds, 40 species of butterflies, and 54 species of flowers have already found their home.
The master plan was designed as a major aim to establish relationship between the existing heritage monuments, the forest as arboretum, and introducing nurseries, and therefore creating various biodiversity zones. The topography is mainly flat, and except for its slightly slopes towards the north and northeast side. Next.
The central element of the network proposed are the pedestrian spine along east-west along the inner side of the southern face of the site, from which the 3 main experiences of the project are directly accessible: the sequential arrangement, the heritage, and the forest arboretum. Supplementing and intersecting with these are the other experiences of recreation and archaeology, and the sequence of gardens in the west and east, and the arc of discovery. Next.
The main circulation pathways, the central axis, which is perpendicular, connects the most of the historic monuments, and a perpendicular axis to which it goes towards the Batashawala complex. And the pathways were designed in a way to create a visitor experience. Breaking this geometry is the Arc of Discovery, which is a gentle curve which gives glimpses of various monuments on its way. Next.
we tried to identify a grid pattern in the nursery and compare it with other influential spaces around. It is a perpendicular continuation of the grid at the Humayun's tomb. The grid remains intact where the central axis is, and it starts breaking up near the water garden and finally into the arboretum that are the infernal gardens of forests. And the Arc of Discovery also helps in getting glimpses of the nearest monuments.
There are basically 5 typologies of garden in the entire complex: the nursery beds, arboretum, formal flower gardens, carpet gardens, and the pathways.
through the how a visitor circulates in the entire complex, we would detail out the garden typology.
The central axis is divided into three parts. The first part is the central grass sward, punctuated with small seatings. On the left is the deep and inviting shade of trees, and on the right is the glimpse of Sundarwala Mahal. Second is the Arc of Discovery, as explained above, and the third is the water garden depends far or less on the rectilinear alignments and weaving between the trees. Next.
The carpet gardens are centered along a long water body from where different perpendicular channels are drawn out, which form different pools at its end. The pools are at lower elevation. The pools also form Mughal jalis, and in the center of them and is the center feature of the orchids.
The water gardens consist of a lake weaving between the existing trees. The irrigation takes place via a network of water channels that overflows into the carved marble deck and slides back to continue the cycle. 10 different patterns of water jalis or water parterres are also used to replicate the historic Mughal examples.
The Azimang Sarai is the 16th century earliest Mughal era grandest sarai in Delhi. The formal flower garden marks the termination of the central axis at its Sundar nursery on one side. Its main feature is a small pavilion sited on the raised grass terrace. Its high elevation allows the visitors to glance back at an unobstructed view. It is surrounded by lush greenery around it, as well as water gardens lined with beautiful flower beds. The nursery gardens are towards the end of the Sundar nursery, lined in a grid. The idea was to combine the functional nature of a nursery space for quiet recreation and contemplation in a botanically interesting setting. Next. The amphitheatre plays a significant role in attracting a significant number of visitors to Sundar Nursery. It serves as an extension to the flower show area. Activities such as cultural events, site management, ecological
Your time is
awareness
up.
programs, including nature walks, are done here. It also provides a platform for local musicians and music transition.
The four main types of materials used in the garden were the chadar stone, which were used for the garden pillars and landscape features. The white marble was used for jali work. The Delhi quartz stone was used for the pathways and decoration work, and the sandstone was used for sitting around and laying the pathway. Next.
To conclude with, the conservation works have drawn attention to this being a unique site of the 16th century garden tombs. In 2016, UNESCO extended the World Heritage designation to 12 structures conserved by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, including these 6 standing structures within the Sundar Nursery. Next.
We're done.
Okay, who's next? Vallabhi.
Yeah, we'll share this.
Yeah,
screen.
Yeah, go ahead. It's a Diana Memorial, is it?
Yes. Yes.
Oh.
Can you guys see the screen?
It's visible, yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. The Diana Memorial Fountain was built in memory of the People's Princess after she died in a tragic car crash in 1997. Designed by Gustafson Porter and Bowman Architects, this project, built on 1.4 acres of land in Hyde Park, London, and costing £3.6 million, was opened by the Queen in 2004.
The concept of the Diana Memorial Fountain, reaching out, letting in, embodies the qualities of the Princess of Wales that made her so lovable, her inclusiveness and her accessibility. The features of the fountain are found in the figure of Diana, approachable, tangible, cozy, never still, and in a way troubled. Hence, the energy and the spirit of the princess are reenacted in the way people interact with the space and with each other.
This talks about the context of the Diana Memorial Fountain. Not only the fountain, but many other spaces around the fountain were also dedicated to Princess Diana. Near the fountain, we have the car park and a cafe. A gallery is located on the west side. A little further from the fountain, we have the Kensington Palace, a round pond, Diana Memorial Sunken Garden, and a park.
The memorial is designed as a peaceful landscape form. It is an oval of water set lightly across the existing contours of the site. The feature uses topography to divert the water downhill in 2 directions. There are 3 bridges where one can cross the water and go to the center. The form is capable of many symbolic interpretations. Example like the circle of life, two people joining, parting, and coming together. Life and death.
We will now be discussing various water flow types. The water bounces down a cascade of richly textured steps with a surface evocative of natural patterns or pleated fabric. After this, there is a level crossing point for people to enter the heart of the oval from the outside of the ring. This symbolizes the stepping in of Diana from a common family into royalty and limelight.
The water then enters an area where the granite has been sculpted so that the water gently rocks and rolls as it travels along a subtle curve. This type of water flow is also the signifier of the turbulent phase of Princess Diana's marriage to Prince Charles in 1981. It came into focus as the marital troubles became increasingly public and the center of attraction of the media a few years down their association.
The water then picks up momentum before it enters a subtle curve where 5 water jets create patterns of water and additional energy is pumped into the fountain. This gentle rippling movement, which the designers have named the swoosh, is also inspired from Diana's life like all the other flows. It is figurative of the gentler, happier phase of her life where she was focused on the upbringing of her sons. It brought calm to her otherwise troublesome marriage.
The granite channel to the west of the source has been highly textured using innovative stone cutting techniques to create a lively play of water which recalls a mountain stream. The water then passes under a level crossing point where the stone channel begins to flatten out. This is the phase of Diana's life which signifies the time where she started to gain popularity and became a people's princess. Her accessibility made her one of the most loved public figures.
As the water travels further, the channel widens out and air bubbles are introduced into the water in 5 locations. The bubbles are carried downstream where the water becomes a tumbling cascade of white water as it corners over a waterfall. This marks the time of reflection in Diana's life post-separation. She came out and talked about her struggles with self-harm and bulimia.
A chadar is a water feature created by the flow of water over elaborately carved stone found in traditional Mughal gardens. The chadar is one of the prominent water features where the water spills over from the western side before tumbling into a large pool at the bottom of the ring. It is synonymous to the highly public part of Diana's life, which came to a halt due to an accident which was caused when she was getting hounded by the paparazzi.
The water traveling from east and west ends its journey in a reflective basin at the lowest point of the water feature. The visible surface of the water at this point is enlivened by the special texturing at the bottom of the pool. The water which is fused leaves the ring at this point. It is then pumped back to the source to continue its unending cycle. This placid pool is like Diana's legacy that is infinite and lives on beyond her lifetime.
In 2002, Gustafsson Porter applied for a design competition where they had used various methods to develop the form of the fountain. The first stage of the design development involved taking a rubber mold of the clay model, which was then used to produce a cast that could be digitally scanned. After winning the competition, the major challenge was to identify methods of construction of the memorial.
With the limit of just 9 months and a year for construction, they initially employed designers experienced in Rhino, but later turned to the Ford Motor Company for help. This was the beginning of a groundbreaking design and fabrication process. SoftDev, a design and 3D scanning bureau, were then commissioned to develop the 3D model. The scan was transformed into a surface mesh CAD model called Jelly Mold.
The basic profile of the memorial was envisaged as 2 edges containing a middle section of textured blocks. Adopting this form, the file was broken into a 3D puzzle of 545 separate blocks with a 5 mm gap, detailing the shape and location of each stone. The model produced the shape of the stones, providing Arup engineers with enough information to produce the underside step foundation and devise the water drainage.
Geoffrey Osborne Limited was appointed as the main contractor, while S. McConnell and Sons from the Northern Islands were selected for the technically intricate cutting work. Work began on site in June 2003. Finally, the stone sections were assembled and the surrounding parkland was re-established in spring 2004.
The water system was designed sustainably, which also affected the ecology of the adjacent Serpentine Lake. Fresh water is pumped out of a 100-meter deep borehole and held in a tank below ground. 10% of the water is drained into the Serpentine.
The stone chosen for this project was Delang granite from a quarry called Enstone Breedon Ltd in Cornwall. It was chosen because it was hard-wearing and non-porous, so that the structure would be long-standing. It was also chosen for its light color to highlight the sparkling quality of water. These stones have been very carefully crafted in order to facilitate the different water flows that characterize this fountain.
To ensure the safety of the people as well as the cleanliness of water, the fountain is manually monitored on a continuous basis. The water circulating is not treated with any chemical and is drawn from London's water table out of a 100-meter deep borehole. The water is in constant motion. This prevents breeding of insects and buildup of algae in the fountain.
2 years after her demise, the project was announced. The designing of the project happened via a design competition in 2001. 2 years later, the site work began. In 2004, the memorial was finally made open to the public but saw some accidents which led to its closure. But soon it was reopened, and just a year later, they installed a fence in the Hyde Park as a necessary precaution.
Your time is up.
Yeah, I think.
I think Vallabi lost net, so I'll just
Yeah,
cover the
Vallabi
last
lost
point.
a connection
The,
only for last.
the project was highly controversial, much like its muse, Princess Diana, and criticized since it did not take into account the large.
Slip on the bed granite stone.
Sorry?
I'm really sorry. I'll just continue. And criticized since it did not take into account the large population that visited the sculpture. People also started to slip on the wet granite stone, leading to many injuries. So later on, the ribs had to be cut within the sculpture to provide footing and a harder surface. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, guys. Interesting. Who's the next group to go?
The Nasher Sculpture Garden.
Okay.
Is the screen visible?
Yeah, Gargi. Just make it full screen, please.
Yeah. So the Nasher Sculpture Garden is located in Dallas, Texas. It is designed by Peter Walker along with Renzo Piano, who designed the museum. So the center is built to house the collection of modern and contemporary sculptures belonging to Nasher and his wife Betsy. So the garden design, it responds to Renzo Piano's building, and the garden was designed to seamlessly integrate the indoor galleries with the outdoor garden spaces, creating a museum experience unlike any other. So the Nasher is mainly located on a rectangular 2.4-acre lot, and the garden occupies 2 acres on the northern end. The construction began in the year 1997 and it was completed by the year 2003. The cost of the project is about $70 million. So the sculpture garden is located in the art district of the city. So in its surrounding, it has cultural art district building, commercial art district building, and it has various places of worship. So the Dallas Museum of Art, it has Dallas Museum of Art in its neighborhood, which has an art collection spanning over 5,000 years.
This is the plan of the structure. So in this plan, you can see that the entrance is from the northeast side, and as we go inside, there is the building on the right side, the landscape in the center, and the water bodies on the left side. The garden is slightly below the street level with these giant walls around. The trees and water features near the street help reduce the sound of the surrounding. The building consists of these 6 parallel walls which divides the building into different parts. About the landscape, so the Nasher garden is similar to the geometric structure of the building, which is organized around these 6 parallel walls. Here each wall extends outside the building onto the back terrace. Although the walls end on to the terrace, there is a continuation of each wall into the garden. Some walls become the rows of the trees, some become the alleys. Gargi, the slides are not changing.
1 second. Yeah, you can talk now.
Although the walls end on the terrace, there is a continuation of each wall into the garden. Some walls become the rows of the trees and some become the alleys, and some become sidewalks which ends abruptly in the garden land. Also, as we move away from the building, the land slopes at 2-degree grade. The space is divided into different viewing areas that highlight each structure. From some sculptures are permanently on the view and some are rotated, so the sculptures and artwork cannot be seen from one location. One has to move in the garden about the building in the so it consists of this open facade on both the sides, so the person inside can take a glimpse of the landscape. We can see that there is a seamless flow in between the indoor and the outdoor. The pattern of the building correlates. Raymond Nash's design concept was actually for the visitors to be free to travel in any direction from one work of art to another.
Talking about the garden, it is enclosed by Travertine Wall, and this garden is an ideally green space which lies in heart of Dallas, which has
the sculpture kept in the garden. So the garden consists of more than 200 mature trees, and most of them are transplanted from various places around the site. And the back wall of the garden consists of various plants extending about the visitor head. And each trees in the garden have their individual drainage system to remove excessive moisture. So the drainage system is covered by a layer of spoil of special earth fill, and which is layered by a layer of sand which is finally covered with Joycia grass. In the garden there are granite plinths which are used to hide services equipment to maintain the garden as well as function to display space for art. So types of species of plant planted in the garden. So the first plant is the oak tree. That architect initially transplanted 12 oak trees from an area near Houston in 2003, and this tree provide year-round shade in the garden. Next are the cedar, which were planted to allow more sunlight to enter the garden in winter, which benefited visitor grass as well as sculpture. Next is the whipping willow, which frames the features of the garden along the broad walkway. Talking about the crepe mites and seasonal flowers which added pop of color in the garden. Next species were magnolias, which were also transplanted in the garden from South Carolina, and this plant accent the exterior wall. Bamboos not only act as a fence but also accent to the exterior wall. And edges and holy shrub take over the role of walls in intersecting way and also define viewing space.
Coming to the water bodies, there are the pencil-sized streams of water cascade from the outer wall near the cafe, splashing into the pools containing flowers. The bubbling fountain rises from three rectangular ponds at the back of the garden. The noise from surrounding street is abandoned by the fountain located on the sides. The lawn utilizes Sportsfield technique. There is 20-feet culvert in the bedrock which provides adequate drainage during strong rains. 4 feet below finished grade is a drainage system covered by layers of special earth fill consisting of a mixture of about 6 ingredients. The layer is 3 to 4 feet thick throughout the site. On top of the earth fill is a 12-inch layer of sand with little strands of fiberglass reinforcing it to provide compressive strength. There is a natural bridging which prevents sand from migrating downwards and create a water flow throughout the system without the use of special filter fibers. Coming to the lighting system, the museum has a fixed lighting system indoors, whereas in outdoor spaces there are fixed lighting in the fountains, statues and walkways. And as you can see in the picture, these lights are flexible and create a calm environment, and this light varies according to the events and the functions taking place.
So the landscape mainly has sculptures in it. It is also used for wedding receptions and social and corporate events. So there are various art related programs for adults, kids and families and students which are offered by the Museum Foundation. So the landscape is considered to be an endangered landscape. It is because there is this 42-story high museum tower building which was built. The building was supposed to be half of its original size. So there is this reflective glass surface which is there on the exterior, which causes a reflection into the museum and in the landscape. So during the peak daylight hours, what happens is that the sunlight is reflected into the museum and in the garden, which increases the temperature. So the tower's glare creates a blinding experience for visitors, and it has also affected the planting, which has caused burning of leaves and the burning of grasses. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So who is the next group? Keyur, Shantanu, Rahul, Sar.
I'm sharing my screen.
Yeah, sure.
Hello. So, double negative land art is the one that we are studying by Michael Heiser. So we first looked at what is land art, and it is also known as earth art, and this is something that is directly made in the landscape, sculpting the land itself into earthwork using natural elements like rocks or twigs. So here are a few examples of what the land art is. Next slide. Michael Heiser is the artist in creating this double negative land art, and he specializes in large scale and site specific sculptures, and he redefines these sculptures in terms of size, mass, gesture, and process. So here are a few works of him, and the picture in the middle is the one that we are studying right now.
Keurans are new disturbance. The site it is located in Mopa Valley in Nevada, and it next slide. Shantanu, next.
Yeah, there's a network issue. Wait.
Yeah. So this is basically a long two trenches of roughly 9 meter by 14 meter by 475 meter long. Next. Yeah. So this was made in 1967 to 70 by artist Michael Heiser, and it was which with the help of art dealer Virginia Dwan. Next. Yeah. So this site comprises of two negative voids in the which are carved out in a red acidic stone, sandstone, which is basically a metamorphic rock from with igneous and sediments. Yeah. Next. Sarth.
The above two images show how Nevada desert was used as a nuclear test site. This was at the height of the Vietnam War. Cold War was going on, and there was a global nuclear apocalypse. The below image shows the process of dynamite bombing to create the trench. Perhaps the artist was channeling his hidden feelings of anger, of political helplessness through this physical gesture.
So, this was constructed during the year 1960 to 1970. So Wilson the person who appointed the land artist was a philanthropist named Wilson, and he kind of donated it to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Nevada in 1985. So now this site is being used by trek and art enthusiasts, basically.
Yeah, so these two images show how double negative is used by people for their digital art. This wouldn't be the case if this art is displayed in a museum or a gallery, which restricts the interaction. Next.
Yeah, so using dynamites and explosion of dynamites and using bulldozers, he carved out this land art that he calls, and the rhyolite on the top, rhyolite stone on the top, he basically carved that out, and he's exposed the inside igneous rocks of the whole landscape. Next. So, in terms of activity, he describes this as something that anyone can experience in their own way, in their own. People can have different opinions of this and what they experience inside the whole space. So, it sits as two negative voids inside this massive land. Next.
There's this famous Japanese sculptorist named Naguchi. Yeah, his quote is like, "If you carve the stone too much, it loses the quality of the sculpture piece." And I feel that this land art had that thing that rawness is maintained by the artist. So this picture shows how is it being used by tourists and like the local tech people, and also Cave showed that how laser shows are all go on there.
Yes. So when one goes to see pyramids, you don't find the relation, but changing the view, you can compare their alignment to a constellation. So while being inside the trench, one can see the opening to the other trench far ahead. But if you see from above, one can observe the big trench that crosses the empty space and continues further. Yes. Often while seeing this land art, we get a question like, is it worth the money spent? So like most of the local people even don't know about its existence. People venturing to find this land art sometimes get lost, even if like if they find this place, they view the undulating landscape below, or you know, if you go
Guys, your
inside the
time is
trench,
up.
if you go inside the trench, like kick some stones, or like not from the point of view of a art enthusiast, but from the point of view of a local person. Yes. Next.
So these are some of the interventions that we took by our side, ki how the artist would have thought of it. So I personally feel that cuboidal void would have been a conceptual thing that he kind of made it into a negative thing, like chucking it out from the land piece. And this is to show what experience would have driven him. So when you walk on the plain surface and this desert, there's a seamless sky there, but eventually you go down this down into the trench, and your body kind of get the interaction of the level which is being decreasing. I think, and you kind of see the open space above in front of you. So this also is an interesting thing that we kind of experience our weight when we are been in a situation like an overhang is in a overhang or anything, any surface in on top of our head, and we kind of feel the weight when it's close to our head, or it's far beyond. So I think that when the person walks into this trench, he kind of feels the tension of the walls on him, which compels him to walk to the open space in front. Yeah, we are done.
No worries. Thank you. We can now open the session for questions, discussions. I think what's interesting is that landscapes of meaning. We basically were looking at a set of projects which were probably done in the last century, and many of them in the last uh, 20 or 30 years. So some of them. So I think that was kind of very different from what we were looking in the earlier session where we were looking at landscapes from the past. So one general question to the class, what do you think was a commonality, that kind of was that you would have found, or what was it that was kind of common about all these projects together, or was there anything that was even common in terms of an attempt? Anyone can answer this question. Yes.
Could it be that all of them are very concept based and not a lot about like in landscape of the past it was a lot about culture and maybe experience, but here like in our case only for Dyna Memorial, like each and every what type of water flow was based on some meaning, and it was like very theoretical from the starting itself. So could that be one thing?
Yeah, that's kind of one of the aspects for sure, because all of them had a certain metaphor, or they were trying to kind of depict a certain meaning, or they were, yeah. So except probably for the Nasha Sculpture Garden, which was more of a background, right? It was more of a setting for other sculptures to kind of come in and then kind of take over. Yeah.
So the design was also supposed to be in such a way that the people, rather than going into into the museum, the architect and also the landscape architect, they wanted to create experiences that the user, they are more pulled out towards the landscape, and then it was more like it was also designed in a way that how the sculpture, how it would everything would look. So main purpose for it was also that basically for for museum kind of experience in the landscape. So I think that was also something that was very purpose based, like they wanted to give this kind of experience. So that is what I thought.
No, absolutely right. Do the faculty members have anything to ask or share? Vandita, Arjun, Shruti, Swati.
I was wondering if the students felt that the meanings in these landscapes of meaning supposedly were either too vague or too difficult to follow. I mean, did the students feel that that you didn't really get the meaning unless it was explicitly told to you all?
Explicitly stated, yeah.
I guess some of them were like, at least in the case of Diana Memorial, when we realized that each, like, there were phases of a life in those water, like, in those variations in the fountain, we were thoda, like, we kept thinking if that was really, in a way, exaggerated or kind of more conceptual. So I guess there was like this discourse between us.
Yeah, like it does not become obvious while looking at the sculpture that it may have such a deep meaning. Like it needs the write up, like or a narrative next to it to explain.
Fair enough. So, do you think that is a problem, or are you okay with it?
I think just like any other concept, like even when we do AD, like any concept is kind of open to interpretation to the viewer. So, I mean, whoever's experiencing it to a certain extent can experience it in a way they want to. But like, yeah, I'm pretty sure they have like a tab over there saying ki this is what this is about. It's
Yeah,
trying
but
to
it
capture
Uh,
Diana.
And adding to what Vidisha was saying, I guess, like in these projects of about meanings, public's opinion or the way the public kind of utilized that space or looked at it with the given background was also important because, like the image of the like for them it was Diana was called as the people's princess. So it was kind of dedicated to her in the sense that she was a very socially approachable
Approachable.
person. Yeah, so I guess even that
And
mattered to
that's
her.
why even the landscape is kind of very approachable, where it's
Focus,
not like a
yeah.
ring where you cannot enter, but it kind of like people enter it and people even put their feet in the water and enjoy whatever in whichever way they want to. So I mean
But
that
then
kind
I found, sorry, yeah, but like then I found like this entire concept of approachability, becoming meaningless because then it became a controversy on its own because the actual design didn't take into account the number of people that were actually coming in. So then they had to put a fence around the entire thing, which kind of rendered the entire concept meaningless. I think.
But I
That's my
guess
two
that was also because of the popularity of the person to whom it was dedicated to. So like since the
Yeah.
person was popular herself, the thing also became very popular and everyone wanted to visit it to remember their beloved princess.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that there is no tab there. There is absolutely no tab there, and it's the fence that you guys mentioned is actually a temporary enclosure that they put during the high visitor density seasons. Like during the summers and other things. But like I've been there, but frankly, I had no clue that each of those meanders basically meant a certain aspect of Diana's life, even though it was understood, but then it
Uh,
wasn't so tacitly, explained.
Actually, so we had looked into her timeline, and then like we knew what those elements were doing, like what kind of effect they were creating. So actually, we were trying to relate it to her timeline.
Yeah, that's
Like we didn't read it. Like
I
it kind
mean,
of made it so
Okay.
dramatic, but
we kind of that was like kind of our analysis because it was said that it was inspired from the different phases of her life, but it was not specifically mentioned which they were. So that was kind of like our
related
analysis in a way,
her
yeah.
different
Okay,
phases.
yeah. So because even I felt that if it were to be mentioned, it was very intrusive, into a personal life, especially of a person whose family members are still alive and kind of around. So it was basically a narrative that you guys created, or the
But like,
parallels that you guys drew out of her life.
but
It was
they
interesting.
didn't want to.
It's interesting. There's no blame on it. It's nice. Yeah.
I think also the fact it maybe we don't know if these were the exact meanings, but they definitely had the meanings, and I'm pretty sure they were not revealed because of the royal family's influence, of course. So because we are like journalists would be punished for it or something.
No, yeah. And the tragedy happened possibly because of this intrusive nature of journalism, right? The paparazzi. So
Yeah,
probably.
exactly.
How about the Sundar Nursery? How many of you could kind of figure out the meanings, or the kind of metaphors that were being discussed? Or what was it earlier? What was the history of that nursery?
Sundar Nursery, initially even we felt it's more of a influential design, like the Mughal influence or the historic monuments which are there. It's more of an influential because of the historic monuments or the history it has. So it took us a time to shift from that. I felt it could connect more to what we were speaking of earlier, also the landscape of past, where it was influenced by things. So yeah, this was like my interpretation for it.
But I also think that there are these different experiences, like the arc of discovery, where it's actually you feel all of that while walking in the nursery, but again, it's in relation to the existing monuments there to highlight the experience of those monuments for ourselves.
And also, if you see the plan of the nursery, the main central part is based on a particular grid, but while you go towards the right, it kind of deforms the grid, and I also think it's based on the movement of the people, the way the central axis joins all the different historic monuments as well as the different formats of the gardens that they have, is mostly based on how people would want to travel through the entire space.
Like it was at the start, it was commissioned also. Like I read somewhere, it was they even started with like the entrance, the common entrance for the visitors to move in the entire complex to view the historic monuments, and that is the same pathway they used in the landscape. Like that was the major start. How the designer started for the concept of it, and that's how they came with the central axis and like the perpendicular axis which connects.
Okay, so what is amazing was the fact that this just before the renovation that Aga Khan Foundation kind of took up this project. That place was a government nursery. Like it was a spot where exotic trees would be got into India during the British time, and they would be tested in that site whether they can then be propagated in that bioclimatic region. So it wasn't a botanical garden per se, but it was basically an abandoned, not so important nursery. But there are major histories to that area even before, the Lodhis and the Mughal eras, wherein there are lots of tombs which were there. And there was a serai which was inside that place. A serai is like a small village where you kind of pause before you embark on, or while you're embarking on a long journey. So there were all these different layers of history which were there, and the monuments were in total disrepair. And that's when Aga Khan Foundation, because of its proximity to Nizamuddin and the Humayun's tomb, which was a World Heritage Site, and Aga Khan Foundation was already working on it. That's when they kind of took up that patch, and then they decided to redo the patch. So all those historic axes that you see, those chadars, those gardens, they're all essentially recreated, or they're kind of imagined, and they were never there in the past. And also because it was a public park of the 21st century. It was basically designed, I think, in 2008 or 9 or something. So because it was a public park of the 21st century, there were also these ideas of sustainability, ideas of representations of different, geographical conditions within Delhi. Like, so how do you kind of create a microcosm of all of that, and then, kind of create a park which is educative also at the same time, which is not just about experience and having a park and a public space, but also one that's educated. But do you know what the controversies that surround projects like these? I mean, even though it's nothing to do with landscapes of meaning, but it's something to do with the socio-cultural way in which we, kind of occupy public spaces. Have you ever come across any article, anything that kind of mentions this particular industry, especially in the post-COVID times? If you haven't, then I would urge you to kind of read about it. I'll give you a hint. It's essentially about the accessibility of public spaces and whether are they truly public spaces, because there's a ticket to kind of enter the space, and also the park is in a place where it's in a VIP zone. So there are lots of areas in Delhi where people do not even have access to an open space near their house. But then there were questions on whether it makes sense to kind of invest so much of money and kind of develop more open spaces or more public spaces in an area which is heavily which has a lot of public spaces around. So there are all of these other questions also that kind of come into play. Okay, how about the double negative land art? What were your reactions to that project?
So we had a nice discussion about it in Arjun's lecture, where so three of us, me, Shantanu, and Raul, we think ki, yes, there is some meaning behind putting this much effort in a piece of land, where Keyur thought ki no, why waste so much money on this kind of a project. So like this guy donated the land to him, to Michael Heiser, and that amount of money could have been used in any other way. But then I personally feel there is this debate would just never end. There is always two sides to it. One can just say कि क्या है इसमें, क्या किया है ऐसा इसने, is what meaning does it have? Whereas it's also true that beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. So that's my opinion about it. I mean, both the sides are correct. Both the sides are wrong as well. I can't decide on to one side.
Another point which I felt like the scale of the project. When you are in that trench, the feel you get is different when you are when you see it from the bird's eye view, maybe in a helicopter or plane. So that's two ways to see it.
So I mean, the ones.
I kind of.
Go ahead, Shantanu.
Thank you. So I personally feel that any architecture work, like be it landscape or interior design, anything, it should invoke some kind of emotion when the person experiences it or touch it. So I think this project was very much successful in that. Yeah, functionality and all. Yeah. We are hired for that to satisfy all the numerical oriented things. But I think we are also responsible to invoke some thought within people.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty much this project was good by that sense.
What do the others think? The ones who were not in the presentation, but the spectators. What are their viewpoints on this? Amit, Akshit.
Actually, I really think that the what Sarth was selling, like it's in the beholder who is seeing the project, like is it worth it or is it not worth it? Like according to me, like if we are seeing the project as an architect or a student, architecture student, so we are really feeling like oh, it's a great thing to see from that kind of space, and how we are seeing is a totally different perspective. But if the normal people or common people will go there and see, they I don't think they can see that beauty beauty in that space, and they can't realize it maybe. But yeah, so it's according, the thing differ according to the people, but according to me it's a beautiful space, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Sandeep, I don't know if you remember this. 2 years ago, when we had this presentation on land art, I think one of the students got up and said, "How do we know we're not being bullshitted by somebody who's just showing anything they want to and then calling it land art? Like, how do you know it is art and how do you know it is not land art?" And obviously, we didn't have the answer to that question, so we are asking you guys. What do you guys think? I mean, how do you know it's not land art?
Well, even the nuclear tests that are then the thing that remains, that is also a land art. If you say if this is a land art, then the nuclear tests were also a land art.
All right.
I think
Nice observation.
Good one. Good one.
But then that's a problem, right? I mean, if anything can be land art, then what is land art? I mean, land art is then everything or anything you point your finger at. You know, I mean, I show you a glass in front of you and think, yeah, that's land art, or that is art.
It's the same story with the abstract art, no, Arjun?
Exactly. I mean, it's problematic. I mean, that kind of a worldview becomes problematic in the sense that if anything can be a land art, then everything is land art, and then there is nothing that differentiates between what is art and what is not art. Suddenly, we have a problem. No?
Yeah, that's a dilemma that we don't have an answer for actually.
So, yeah. Go ahead. Whoever was speaking, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Whoever was. I think artists who make this thing, or anyone, I don't think they segregate like this is graphic design or this is engineering or something like that. They just, I think it's like we segregate things. I don't know to characterize them, but I don't think it has to do anything with the one who makes it. There's a different motive, I think.
Okay. If we are classifying, we can broadly classify into like 2, 3, 4, 5 parameters. One would be how old it is. Second would be uniqueness of it. So can it be reproduced, mass produced, or that? Third would be, can this be thing made by me? Like that we saw recently was that banana was like stuck with a duct tape on a wall. So that thing, if it could be made by me, so the value for me, the value loses.
Okay.
But to this question, I have a counter thought. Ki, yes, you can do it, but did you ever think of doing it before someone else did it? So yeah, it's unique in its own way, na. Like yes, you can say कि यार ये तो मैं भी कर सकता, but तूने नहीं किया वो. It's someone else's thought.
No, those are interesting viewpoints. I mean, one refers to the uniqueness of it, and one is the originality, right? Not
Yeah.
originality. I'm not sure if originality is the right word, but yeah, I mean, it was there. I mean, someone who did it for the first time. No, I think originality is the correct word.
So I have a small observation and a question to follow that. So all these presentations that we saw in these gardens, though they were done in recent times, we would say compared to the vast garden history, but there was, sorry, always a strong emphasis on every small thing that was going in the design process. It had an expression, there was a meaning. Are we losing that relevance in the current time? And when I say current, let's say like, projects that are being designed or being commissioned in the last, let's say 5-10 years. Okay, for example, something as recent that and I'm talking in the national context, like in India specifically, something as latest as, let's say, the Statue of Unity that came up. It was supposed to symbolize, let's say, a person or his work or his contribution But when the design process came into picture, you think the architects or the landscape architects held on to the relevance and designed everything accordingly, or because of the socio-political environment that we are existing right now? I don't know, for or against it. I just want to understand what the students feel about how meaningful are we now in the current scene when we are designing such projects which are supposed to have or hold a lot of meaning to it.
That's a great question, Bandita. I mean, would the students want to kind of react to it?
I feel the intent here matters a lot, as I've read articles where articles by people opposing the statue, saying that this is just so. I don't remember who this guy is, but he compared this to a toll plaza where. Uh, so it's become a place where people go. People are amazed by how massive the statue is, and for entering there they have a 5 rupee ticket. Now 5 rupee ticket is something very is okay with most of us, but then lots of people go there, and that's how the government collects revenue. So uh, I think the intent of the architect or the person making that thing matters a lot, because if there is pressure or such a pressure by the government or by the authority ki yeah, we are looking for something to collect revenue, and if the architect or the creator fights with them ki let's look for a space that people can enjoy as well, so I don't know, maybe that's what I think. The intent matters a lot.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I also believe that intent is an important part of creating something with meaning or creating artwork. I mean, that's something I wanted to ask about, but let's first discuss Bandita's point.
I guess the intent was to make the tallest statue, right?
Yeah, and in that sense, they are very, very successful. They're like 100% success. What I notice is that, I mean, the gardens, I mean, this is probably because we lose a lot of information through history, but I mean, these Horace's garden in England have these references to Greek mythology, because the owner himself was very well read on Greek and Latin, and what you sort of start noticing is that a lot of the good quality. Hang on, there's a plane overhead. Hang on. And what you notice a lot is that the quality of the garden and the qualities of the owner. I mean, there's a very strong interconnection between the quality of the garden and the quality of the owner. And this is something that was told to us when we were in college, and I sort of I mean, through time I started realizing that it is quite true, and is that the clients get the gardens they deserve. And there's also, they say, this is what they say about democracy as well, right? You get the leaders you deserve. It's like that, you get the gardens the client deserves. And if the client is basically someone who says, you know what, I want this done to specification, मेरे को SOR में बिठाना चाहिए और मेरे को इस budget के अंदर होना चाहिए, you're essentially going to get a project that is fitting in that budget, that matches the criteria of the SOR, which is Schedule of Rates of Bombay or Delhi or whatever, wherever. And you're going to get a project that is very, very tall and that fits in budget. Maybe it fits in budget. Essentially, if you had government leaders who said, you know what, I'm looking for meaning in this garden, like explain to me what this bench, why this bench is built the way it is, you're going to have people who drive the project in a particular direction. At least that's my response to what Bandita was saying. I don't know what Bandita thinks though.
Fair enough, Arjun. I think I liked that, you know, like emphasis was on intent. I think that defines a lot of things. It starts with that first step as to what exactly you're wanting to achieve, and I think then everything just follows that direction.
Sandeep, Shruti, Swati, what do you guys think?
No, I think I agree with what you said, Arjun, that it's the intent that actually matters, you know, to start with. And of course, there are all sorts of other levels of complexities, and contradictions, and that kind of feed into this whole process of how a landscape is conceptualized and eventually built. Uh, so yeah, but I think fair enough. I mean, I think that's a very valid point. Uh, what about Shruti and Swati?
So I don't know. The intent was to make the tallest statue, but I'm not sure. I had a lot of thoughts and discussions with a lot of people on this. The point is, in the current scenario, just having that intent is fair for a country like India was also one of the questions that I had in my mind. So I'm not sure if this is the right platform to discuss that. First, there are so many people who do not have access to the open spaces and other things, and there is a lot of money to be spent on spaces which have meaning, spaces which are accessible. So I'm not sure if the intent was itself having any meaning at this point in our country. So.
I mean,
Yes,
this
I
was.
mean, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry,
sorry.
go ahead.
Go ahead, Swati.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I agree that I think when you're driven by intent, largely, at least we'd hope that it's going in the right direction. But I think problems arise when we're trying to be iconic or monumental in a sense. So, in a situation that we are in, I don't know if iconic or monumental is the way to be, because who are we talking about and what are we kind of uh, representing, So I just feel like that, I mean, so we also kind of did this project competition that was in Meghalaya, in Shillong, and that the brief on the RFP document from the government of Meghalaya also kind of spoke about this iconic structure required at Barrick Point. And I don't know if there's value to it, but because eventually you're kind of trying to um, address a larger landscape of people, and I don't think it needs to be iconic or monumental, in that sense. So we begin to see it very incorrectly if we kind of go down that road. So I mean, I think that's where I'd like to leave it. I don't know if I'm making too much sense and trying to.
No, you do. Absolutely do. I mean, the same could be kind of extrapolated to the Central Vista redevelopment that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. So what do students think? What is their opinion on this, and as well as on Central Vista, the Parliament building? And do you guys read about it? Do you have any opinions?
I'm sure they do. So let's hear from the ones whom we haven't heard today. Come on, guys. I mean, we are like, 73 people online and just 5 of us speaking. Okay, I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to hear from the students now. Arjun, how do we do this? Do we call out people and then ask them to respond?
Yeah, that's usually my methods. I mean, I just call a random name and then ask a question, but you can do that.
I think that's very effective. Probably in this particular day and time, I think that's very effective. Shrestha.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
This even in like humanities, recently we had a lecture where we were looking at how the proposals for riverfront projects and the Eastern Riverfront project also, and they were talking about how all these we come up with these monumental or extremely commercialized versions for riverfronts where it's essentially we look at kind of selling the city for other businesses or developments. We make it more attractive, and like it's essentially becomes a commercial space, but we don't think about the demands that it'll place on the areas surrounding it, because it's usually not it's in areas where there is already water demands, and there's a lot of pressure on the land, but then we come up with these schemes that are essentially supposed to be attractive rather than sustainable. So that's
I had this question, like, in general. So while designing things, like, we always come up with this concept, but the concept does not hold when a person who has to use the building comes, like, he is not there to understand the concept. Like, so why do we come up with these these long concepts before designing a building? Like, before we start with our AD, we always develop a concept. Why can't it be just a user friendly concept, like क्या यूज होने वाला है उस बिल्डिंग का, उस हिसाब से, like when we see, like, we develop the concepts in plan, like, the one who is using the building is not going to see the plan and see, like, yeah, he has done this, these are the focal points he developed, and like all of those things are like weird. Like, the person who is going to use the building is going to be in there, so the experience should be from in there and not from building up the concept. So like the land art or like any of the gardens, they have these imaginations in their mind. They put it on paper, but does it hold valid for the person who is using it in the end?
So I think the responsibility lies in the hands of designer, that the concepts that are put across and the designs that are put across have meaning that could be experienced by the end user. Don't you think so?
Yeah, it should be that, but always, while thinking of a concept, we never think of the user, right? So like, if the, like, that's what happens always.
I think an important thing to mention here is that the concept never comes at the cost of the requirements of the brief, which is essentially user friendliness, and the requirements of the user are never sacrificed because we have a concept. So let's say you're looking at two different office spaces, or both of them satisfy the requirements of the user. It's spacious. It can be used. It has good legibility. It's good for your health. Blah 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 blah. Are you saying beyond that we don't need to look at anything as long as both of these, all of these requirements are met?
Yeah, well, if it is going for an aesthetic value, or if it is like going for in AD we always have these sometimes we have these rules, the courtyard and the space around it, then the veranda and all those sort of things. But then if you see, sometimes it is like we vaguely design it in plans, but it is like an open kind of thing, like you can change it at any time, place this building, like turn it around like this. So like it is like total, like many things are there. Like it is sometimes like there are a lot of rules, and sometimes it is like you have to break all the rules and come up with your own designs. Then it goes all confusing and mix and matching. I don't know what to say.
I think the truth is chaos. There are no rules.
Yeah, and also you will evolve as a designer as time passes. You all these questions and confusions that you have will eventually get resolved.
Yeah, it's really difficult to have your concept survive the process of design. Forget the process of design. Even if it survives the process of design, whether it will survive the process of construction is still another question. And
True.
I mean, life in that sense is ridiculously hard for us architects who like to have spaces with meaning. That being said, what I got from your question was, is it worthwhile to have a concept, or is it worthwhile to have any other quality that differentiates one space from the other, as long as every other requirement or the brief requirement has been met. And I think anyone, my guess is even you would probably say, okay, if all the requirements are met, then I would like to see some sort of a meaningful concept for one place being different from another. Am I understanding that correctly, Keyur? Or
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. But the unfortunate reality is that having a design, so having an idea survive the entire process of design and construction is mind-bogglingly difficult. I mean, that's why architecture takes 5 years, I guess.
I would like to make a comment.
Please do, please do.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I'll give an example. Like there's a American director named Christopher Nolan, and he has this amazing movie Inception. It's a heavy movie for any like I find it heavy. एक बार में नहीं समझे. But when we think in that way, if he assumes that the spectators are not going to understand in the first place, he won't be creating such amazing movies. You kind of get the analogy. If you assume that people are not going to get it, you in the first place itself you kind of lose the thing of making like the potential to break some grounds and make something. I don't know. I put it in the right way.
That's a nice thought.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So what I think is instead of like having a concept, intention would be more beneficial. Like placing a wall, so that and making it functional in a particular, way, so that the concept fits in, would be like forcing the space instead of placing a wall and making it function in a certain manner that creates a where different experience of the space that also creates the space that I have intent to would be more beneficial. So intention would be more beneficial over concept. What I think.
This reminds me of a story, and I just okay, hang on, Lane, I'll just wait for a minute. Okay. In 2005, B.V. Doshi had visited Academy of Architecture. I was just passing out at the time, and he was there to be a guest of honor for some sort of a function. So if he's here, तो एक lecture तो बनता है. So we were all huddled over there, and B.V. Doshi is he's a fairly funny guy. He gave a very nice presentation. He showed all of his old projects, so on and so forth. And right in the end, he sort of gave a closing remark. What he said was that let's say you're taking a walk to a sort of like a forested area, like taking a walk through nature, and it has just rained, so you're smelling the earth, right? And as you walk along, you come across this branch that's fallen on the road, and the wood is cool to touch. And you walk even further, and you see this small rock edge over which water is trickling down in an interesting way. And then a couple of years later, you're asked to build a house. And the house is there, all the bedrooms are there, all the kitchen is there, and blah, 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 everything is all there. And then you have this dead wall on which you create this funny elevation detail with bricks. All right, and then you're sort of designing you're designing the balcony, but instead of having a metal railing, you decide to have a wooden railing. And on the courtyard, instead of paving it all up in concrete, you just leave it out as mud. You intentionally leave it as mud. And then what happens is, just after the rains, a little of the trickle from the terrace comes over this wall because you've allowed the trickle to come, and it goes down that wall in exactly the same funny way you saw it a couple of years ago down that rock. And then you're standing in the balcony to watch that happen, and your hands touch the railing, and it's cool to touch because the rains have made the railing cool. and the courtyard, because it was all mud, it still carries the smell of rain, and it allows it to waft through the air, and it seeps all through your house. And what he said was that when you start making these connections, right, between the world around you and the ideas in the world around you and in the spaces that you build, then that is architecture, at least according to him. And that's a story that has stayed with me for a really, really long time, because I loved how he described the world around him, and was able to distill it for the ideas it bore, and use those distilled ideas in the construction spaces that he was creating. And so what he's essentially saying is that there's a difference between engineering and architecture. And engineering is when you've created the rooms and you've given the bed and there is the wardrobe. But architecture is when you sort of connect this engineering to these interesting ideas, and then you create an experience out of it. So, I mean, I thought this was a nice time to share this story with you, since Keyur brought up the topic of concepts and whether they survive or not.
Worth the silence.
True.
Embarrassing. Okay.
No, I think over time we just evolved to, and hopefully in the process we'll keep evolving to um, understand that concept eventually is intent, like Amit mentioned. And I think we'll all understand how to kind of negotiate between the two, for the lack of a better word, and still keep it alive in experience. Um, I think the concept is more the experiential aspect of it and what the narrative is, and sometimes these things are also seen in hindsight. Like, it makes a great story to tell later. So sometimes the concept is also seen in hindsight, and it's something that the process has evolved into. So I think over different kinds of projects, it just becomes different things. It doesn't necessarily just remain one line that you've drawn in plan, that needs to kind of be built on site.
So, what are students' takeaway from researching all these projects and gardens? Like, how was the process for all of you? I mean, there was a lot of information that you gathered, but was it interesting? Did you enjoy the whole process of learning about these new projects and then getting assimilating all the information? You might have exposed yourself to so many new things. So, how was your journey and experience through it?
Yeah, each of these gardens have really interesting stories to them. So that was one thing that I really enjoyed looking up.
Any learnings from them?
Yeah, the one thing I really found interesting was the art part of it. Like, I didn't think landscape and art could be combined.
Interesting.